Before we begin, take a deep breath and let the noise of the day slowly fade. Unclench your jaw, soften your eyes, and let the weight of modern life melt away. Tonight, we're not chasing action or drama. We're wandering into the forgotten corridors of boring history where medieval echoes linger and dark tales unfold like fading ink on parchment. Welcome to Midnight Sleepless, a resting place for tired minds. Stories drift by like soft clouds. Here, knights, castles, and quiet empires return not with a roar, but with a whisper. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it there? And if you enjoy these slow, sleepy journeys through medieval times, boring facts, and forgotten worlds. In the vast machinery of Napoleon's campaigns, mid the roll of cannon wheels and the stamping of boots through frozen mud, there were tucked into satchels and crates small treasures. They did not gleam like medals or weigh as much as muskets, yet they held immeasurable value: sugar, coffee, brandy. These were not everyday rations. They were luxuries, rare, rationed, and often hoarded. But when they appeared, even in trace amounts, they softened the sharp edges of a soldier's day. A single spoonful of sugar stirred into weak coffee, or a swallow of brandy passed between frostbitten hands, could turn silence into murmured laughter. It could remind a man, if only for a moment, of cafes in Lyon or kitchens in Marseille, or a spring morning long before the march. Cooks prized these ingredients not only for their taste, but for their power to gather men near the fire. Sugar could sweeten the bitterest decoction of bark and root. Coffee, often ground with mortar stones and boiled to a black sludge, was offered in small, hot sips that chased sleep from aching bones. And brandy, thick and golden, came not in bottles, but in flasks passed between comrades with the slow reverence of something sacred. There was no standard issue for these things. They arrived sporadically, smuggled in by sutlers, gifted by officers, or discovered in the stores of abandoned towns. When supply wagons did carry them, they were guarded with care, often marked with chalk or hidden beneath blankets of flour sacks to prevent theft or miscounting. When sugar arrived, it came in hard. Knotted cones, sometimes wrapped in cloth or paper, stamped with foreign letters. Cooks broke it with mallets or the butt of a knife, tapping gently so as not to waste a grain. The crystals, when stirred into tea or coffee, clung to the spoon in slow syrup. Soldiers would suck on the remnants, letting them dissolve slowly. Like a memory. Coffee was often a mixture of ground beans, chicory, and whatever roasted grain could be found. Real coffee was rare, and when it came often in small cloth pouches, it was treated like gold. The aroma alone could draw men from their tents. It curled through the morning frost and reminded them of home. Even the act of boiling it, watching the black foam rise, then settle, offered a kind of ritual comfort. It was strong, bitter, and often gritty, but it was hot, and that mattered more than taste. Brandy was the rarest of the three, and also the most shared. Officers carried it in silver flasks. Soldiers drank it from tin cups. A sip before dawn, a drop after a march, a quiet toast beside the fire. It did not warm the body for long, but it softened the world for a moment. On especially cold nights, a cook might add a splash to the pot, not for flavor, but for the comfort of the scent it carries when heated, warm, sharp, a little sweet. a reminder of civility amid the churn of war. These comforts, small as they were, did not change the course of the campaign, but they changed the shape of the day. They marked time. They offered a pause, and around them men found reasons to linger, to talk, to share. Even now, more than 2 centuries later, the memory of a soldier's sugar, coffee, and brandy remains, not in textbooks, but in journals, in letters, and in the quiet recollections passed down through kitchens and firesides, because sometimes history is written not in battles, but in what men reach for when the fire burns low. As the days of the campaign wore on and the snow deepened around tired boots, the value of sugar, coffee, and brandy could not be measured in weight or coin. These were not staples of survival like flour or salt. They were rarer still fragments of a life that seemed distant, yet somehow still within reach. A single lump of sugar, carefully wrapped in cloth or tucked into a cartridge pouch, could remain untouched for weeks, saved for a birthday, a name, day, or a quiet celebration known only to the man who carried it. Cooks who were fortunate enough to have a cone of it rationed the contents by the grain, tapping crystals into bowls like jewelers measuring dust. The sweetness, when it reached a tongue weathered by weeks of salted meat and frozen biscuit, bloomed like fruit in spring. It needed no quantity to be felt, just presence. Some units kept a communal sugar cone, watched over by the senior cook or trusted quartermaster. It was placed in the center of the kitchen wagon, wrapped in wax cloth and bound in twine, a treasure equal to silver. From it, slivers were scraped for coffee, shavings sprinkled into soup for the sick, or small crystals handed to soldiers whose spirits seemed to wane beneath the weight of frost and fatigue. These moments were brief and wordless, an open hand, a quiet nod, but their meaning lingered. Coffee, when it could be brewed, became a ritual in itself. The fire was lit with extra care. Water, often scarce, was melted from packed snow and strained through cloth to remove grit. The beans, or more often, their roasted substitutes, were ground with stones, rifle butts, or iron pans. The resulting powder, coarse and uneven, but once poured into the pot and stirred with a wooden spoon, the scent rose in dark, fragrant coils that wound through the camp and curled beneath tent flaps. Men gathered, not in lines but in loose rings, bowls and cups held in gloved hands. The coffee was always hot, sometimes scalding, and nearly always bitter. Yet few complained. The heat spread through the chest. The scent called back memories of home, the creak of a chair beside a hearth, the whistle of a kettle, the sound of spoons tapping in a quiet morning kitchen. These recollections did not distract from war. They stitched comfort through its fabric. Some cooks experimented, blending the coffee with browned flour, burnt bread, or ground chicory root to stretch the supply. Others dropped in a sliver of hard cheese or a spoonful of grease for the body. These additions were not traditional but practical, and still the warmth remained. Brandy, however, was different. It did not appear in kitchens so much as in brief flickers at the edge of fires, in the folds of coats passed between gloved hands. It came in small flasks of pewter or glass, hidden in packs or strapped beside muskets. When offered, it was not poured lavishly, just a sip, a mouthful, enough to warm the throat and slow the trembling in fingers numbed by wind. Officers, more often than privates, had steady access to brandy. But many shared it, especially in moments of distress. After a long march, after the burial of a comrade, after crossing a frozen river by moonlight, one soldier recalled, years later, that he never learned the name of the lieutenant who pressed a flask into his hands one bitter morning. He said nothing, the man wrote, just watched me drink and nodded. It tasted of firewood and cherries. Sometimes brandy was added to the evening meal, a splash, into stew or into the cook's coffee. The alcohol burned off quickly, but its scent lingered, lifting the dish above its humble ingredients. Soldiers would sniff the air and murmur their guesses, as if the war were far away and the only concern was whether the cook had found cloves, or wine, or pepper. These little comforts did not create joy. They simply reminded the men that joy had once existed and might. Again, that were moments of softness among hard days, in a world where boots froze solid overnight and beards held ice long after the sun rose. A cube of sugar or a warm cup of coffee became a kind of kindness, one that asked for no return. A cook who gave his own portion to a young recruit, a corporal who shared the last of his flask with a man too cold to speak. These were quiet gestures, almost invisible beside the grand currents of history, and yet they endured. More than 2 centuries later, the taste of that coffee, the sharp breath of that brandy, and the fragile sweetness of sugar are recalled not as indulgences, but as anchors. They did not make the marches shorter or the battles easier, but they made the hours bearable. They gave the mind something to hold when the world turned white and the maps ran out. Around those fires, as spoons stirred slowly and flasks changed hands, men remembered that they were still men. Not just uniforms, not just ranks, but people, cold, tired, hungry, capable of small kindnesses, shared warmth, and the enduring hope that tomorrow might come with a little more sugar. As the snows receded and the Grande Armée pulled westward from the ruins of its ambitions, the little comforts, sugar, coffee, brandy, grew scarcer still. But their memory remained, lingering like scent in the folds of a scarf. Even when the last pouch of grounds had been emptied, the last cube of sugar dissolved into bitter blackness, and the final sip of brandy burned down a soldier's throat, the rituals remained. The morning fire still flickered, and hands still extended bowls toward the pot. Steam rose, men gathered, and even if the pot held nothing but warm water and bark, they drank it slowly, as if it were still coffee. By remembering the motions, the body might still feel the warmth. For many soldiers, the absence of these things was not met with complaint. There was too much silence in their bones for bitterness. But they did speak of them softly when the day's march was done, or when the frost had left their fingers long enough to move freely again. A man might say there was a morning near Smolensk when the cook had sugar, and others would nod. They would remember the way it caught on the tongue, the way the spoon clinked in the tin cup, the way it tasted almost like sunlight. In these recollections, sugar was not sweetness, seed was grace, a reminder that the world once held more than ash and snow, that somewhere beyond the horizon someone still measured cups by teaspoons and not by weight. Someone still added sugar to morning bread. Someone still laughed over coffee in the warmth of a room. Coffee, too, was more than drink. It was a pause, a way of marking morning, a reason to sit And even after the beans were gone, men mimicked the gesture. They boiled bark, they steeped roasted roots, they passed the warm cup from hand to hand. It was not about the taste, it was about the hands, about the steam rising, the way the body cradled the heat, the way breath and silence mingled above. It, brandy, though rarely mentioned aloud, was felt the longest. In letters home it was called a light, a balm, or simply the gift. A sip was never wasted. It was passed to the man who shivered most, to the one who could not rise, to the one who had just lost someone the night before. It wasn't much, but it told the soldier, you are not alone, you are seen, and that mattered more than flavor. These memories outlasted the war. Decades later, when veterans gathered in quiet cafes or village inns, the talk sometimes drifted not to glory or loss, but to taste. One might recall the sharpness of cheap brandy warmed in a tin cup. A third might speak of the time they found sugar in a merchant's cellar, and how the cook stirred it into barley and let it caramelize into something that almost tasted like pudding. These were not stories of conquest. They were stories of endurance, of humanity kept alive by the smallest things. In time, the coffee returned to the kitchens. Sugar flowed again in shops. Brandy was sipped beside fireplaces, no longer in tin flasks, but in clear glass. And yet, those who had once tasted these things with trembling hands never forgot how different they had been when taken in the snow, how precious, how grounding. Some saved a cube of sugar wrapped in cloth and kept in a drawer. Others kept an old tin cup on a shelf, a flask, empty, polished with age, passed down to a son or grandson, but as reminders that in the coldest of winters, it was not weapons that sustained the spirit, it was warmth, a spoonful of sweetness, a swallow of fire, a smell that rose from a pot when nothing else did. These things cannot be charted on a map or tallied in a logbook, but they lived in the hearts of those who marched, those who stirred the pot, and those who held out their hands, trusting that there would be just enough to share. And so, though the war moved on, and the rations changed, and the snow melted, the comfort remained in memory, in ritual, and in the soft rhythm of stirring, pouring, sipping, sugar, coffee, brandy, not food, not drink, but warmth. Beneath the clang of sabers and the echo of boots on frozen earth, the heart of Napoleon's army beat with quiet regularity its rhythm, not always found in formations or orders, but in kitchens, tucked behind the marching lines, beside the medical tents and supply wagons. The field kitchen followed its own chain of command. Here, too, there was discipline. Here, too, orders were given. But instead of shouted commands and drills, the day was structured by the subtle authority of fire, spoon, and flame. It may surprise some to imagine military discipline extending to the cook's station, but within the Grande Army kitchens were not exempt from the structures that governed soldier life. Each cook, often chosen not for culinary experience, but for physical reliability and availability, was expected to obey a routine every bit as rigorous as the marching column's reveille. For the cook came earlier than for most, long before sunrise, when the camp was still cloaked in frost and sleep. The appointed cook and his assistants began their duties. The tasks were immediate and unforgiving. Fires must be lit, water fetched, provisions, any accounted for. The cook, even in his woolen cap and grease-marked coat, was not just a laborer. He was a logistics officer in miniature, managing calories, fuel, and time under conditions that shifted daily. The field kitchen was organized, whenever possible, by section or company. For every group of 40 to 60 men, one cook was responsible. He worked in tandem with a furrier, kind of supply overseer, who reported the number of men to be fed and the ingredients available. This division of labor, though simple, followed strict protocol. If the numbers changed, wounded soldier returned, a new recruit arrived, the cook had to adapt, portioning soup or bread accordingly. Every action had its place, and every moment its rhythm. Fires were started with small kindling arranged in tight triangles, positioned for protection from the wind. Pots were placed in precise order of use: water for boiling, soup to simmer, beans to soak. Spoons were wiped clean between uses. Storage. Cloths were knotted with the same loops day after day, not out of habit alone, but to allow quick access and reliable inventory. Tools were cleaned and checked, knives sharpened at the same hour. Ashes sifted out of the fire pit to prevent sour smoke from settling into the food. Ladles were tied to hooks or branches with bits of twine, handles always pointing in the same direction. Such details might seem trivial, but they created consistency. And in war, consistency was its own form of peace. No cook acted alone. Each was paired with one or two aides, young boys, wounded men recovering from injury, or those awaiting reassignment. These assistants learned through imitation, not lecture. They watched as the cook gauged the readiness of a pot by its hiss, determined doneness by the scent of boiled cabbage, or measured salt with a fingertip. The learning was quiet, layered into gestures and repetition, and above all, there was timing. The army moved according to the day's orders. Marches were set at specific hours, drills timed to minutes. The cook had to finish his work in alignment. If breakfast was delayed, men went hungry. If soup wasn't ready before dusk, there might be no firelight to finish it. Each missed moment carried consequences. Food was not merely sustenance, it was coordination. A hot bowl at the right hour could steady a day of chaos. A delay could fray tempers and morale alike. Inspection, too, extended to the kitchens. Officers occasionally walked through the cooking area, noting fire safety, cleanliness, and portion control. A cook found wasting flour or hoarding meat could face reprimand or worse, not because of the food itself, but because discipline depended on fairness and shared sacrifice. The field kitchen was one of the few places where the lowest soldier and the highest officer might receive the same meal. If the soup was thin, it was thin for all. Yet discipline here did not mean harshness. It meant rhythm, repetition, a kind of dignity woven into the smallest tasks. To slice turnips with precision, to divide beans without favor, to stir the same pot with the same movements every morning. In a world that spun with uncertainty, the cook's movements held stillness, and so, amid the mud and the march, the field kitchen stood as a post of quiet order, a place where rules were not barked, but followed in silence, where the ladle became a symbol of steady command, where discipline, instead of being shouted, was stirred. By midday, the cook's station was a quiet orchestra of movement. There were no shouted commands, no barked orders, just the soft clink of iron on iron, the muted scrape of ladle in pot, the gentle rhythm of slicing and stirring. Yet within that silence, a discipline no less strict than the parade ground governed. Every step, each task, repeated day after day, became ritual. And within ritual, order was maintained. It began with the supplies, provisions, if they came at all, arrived early, often brought by a supply runner or quartermaster aide, trudging through mud or snow, with a folded inventory scribbled in charcoal. These lists were short: 2 sacks of flour, half a salted beef, a handful of onions, perhaps some dry lentils or stale bread crusts from another company. The cook inspected them with care. Spoiled items were set aside, not discarded, but earmarked for boiling, scrubbing, or flavoring. Nothing was wasted, but nothing was used thoughtlessly either. Each item had its place. Root vegetables were laid out beside the fire trench. Salt, if available, was stored in a horn or folded cloth. Bread was unwrapped and broken into meal portions. These arrangements were not aesthetic. They were practical, a form of visual accounting. When a cook looked at his layout, he saw his plan, his tempo, his margins of error. The fire had its own cadence. Too hot, and it risked burning the pot's bottom. Too low, and the stew would not soften in time. Cooks knew to feed the flame slowly, sliding in sticks one by one like a metronome, counting out a steady beat. They adjusted for wind with barriers of stone or crates. In some cases, they scooped trenches or built earthen walls, not by command, but by inherited knowledge passed down from the last cook, or learned by watching. And through it all, time pressed on. Lunchtime was not a suggestion. It was a schedule. At precisely the hour set in the day's orders, sometimes delivered before dawn, sometimes only an hour before service, the cook was expected to ladle out hot rations. No excuse of wind, cold, or broken carts could delay it. The food must be ready, and so everything led to that moment. Cooks learned to count the simmer, the way the broth lifted in slow bubbles, the way the scent spread from pot to tent line, the sound the ladle made when it touched the side of the cauldron, how hollow, how heavy. These were his clocks. He needed no bell to tell him when the meal was ready. His body learned the rhythm. Assistants, too, fell into step. They swept away husks, scrubbed the pot sides with sand or ash, fetched water, or carried hot bowls to the edges of the company lines. They learned to anticipate the cook's hand, to offer the spoon before it was asked, to reach for the salt before a word was spoken. Their movements became mirrored, synchronized, not by drill, but by repetition. When the food was finally served, it was done with surprising formality. Bowls were filled evenly, often by count rather than eye. 1 ladle per man. Occasionally 2, if the supplies allowed. Each portion was the same, no matter a man's rank, mood, or favor. This uniformity mattered. It was not just about fairness, it was about morale. A good cook became, in his own way, a mediator. He did not speak often, but he listened, he observed, and he served with balance. There were quiet rules, too. No tasting from the ladle. No extra salt unless shared with all. No saving of scraps unless designated for the sick. Trust in the cook was sacred. Inspections could come at any time. A lieutenant might pass by and ask to see the pot. Even the general staff, during rare stops, might stroll through the kitchens, nostrils twitching, eyes glancing at cleanliness, order, efficiency. Most passed through in silence. But the cook noticed. He stood straighter. He stirred more carefully. He knew his work was being read like a report. And yet, even amid discipline, there was softness. Cooks were not brutes. Soldiers gravitated toward the pot, not only for food, but for familiarity. The cook was the man who did not raise his voice. He greeted men not with orders, but with a bowl. Sometimes a cook would add an extra spoon for the man who had marched furthest, or he would hold back a scrap of onion for the sick, or he would tuck a hard biscuit into the pocket of a soldier who had said nothing all day. Gave the field kitchen its power, not from rank, but from rhythm, not from orders. Clean, the fire in the field kitchen softened to a quiet glow. The sounds of eating gave way to low voices and the occasional clink of tin against stone. The cook, now moving more slowly, and the cook's presence steady.com and deliberate gave the camp something more precious than rations. It gave it rhythm. After the last soldier returned to his blanket and the officers to their tents, the cook's work continued. Pots had to be scrubbed, if not clean, then at least free of crust. Cloths wrung out and hung where the breeze might dry them. Tools laid out in the same careful pattern as always, handles aligned, blades tucked safely beneath folds of cloth. No one inspected these gestures. No eyes watched the cook as he bent over the basin or arranged the firewood. But he did them all the same, because tomorrow would come with its own orders. And tomorrow, the cook must be ready before the first horn sounded. He folded his cloth slowly and tucked it into his pack. He placed a round stone into the cooled pot to keep it from warping overnight. He set the spoon, worn smooth by months of use, on the same flat rock where he placed it every night. There was comfort in repetition, in knowing that no matter how chaotic the day, the spoon would rest in its place. The pot would be waiting. The dough would rise, even if only slightly. The fire would catch again. Sometimes, in the quiet, a soldier would return, a soft step beside the fire. No words, just a hand extended with a dented cup. The cook might dip once more into the pot, find the thinnest scrape of broth, and pour it gently. He didn't need to ask why. Where men who had seen their ranks diminish, their friends fall, their spirits could still return and find, without question, something warm. The field kitchen never celebrated. It did not sing, it did not raise flags, but it remembered. It remembered the count of spoons, the smell of barley, the feel of a ladle against a pot worn thin at the rim. It remembered how long lentils took to cook, how many bowls could be served from a half pint of fat. It remembered the names of the men who had stood by it last week, last month, yesterday, and in that remembering, others were replaced when wounded, reassigned, or lost. But each new cook picked up the same ladle, the same habits, and in doing so, stepped into a role as crucial as any on the front line, not because he commanded others, but because he fed them. Even now, when the history of Napoleon's armies is recounted in volumes of strategy, in tales of glory and loss, the field kitchen is rarely mentioned. Yet it was there, every day, every mile. Rifles, maps, spirits, the discipline of the kitchen held, because even at the edge of the world, in the rhythm of Napoleon's Grande Armée, the cook was a fixture as dependable as the morning fire. His hands, steady from repetition, stirred the pot at the same hour, without pause. And when illness struck, when the cook did not rise before reveille, or failed to light the morning flame, it was felt more deeply than most absences. A missing soldier meant a gap in formation. A missing cook meant a gap in nourishment, routine, and quiet stability. There were no official replacements standing by. Instead, the field kitchen adapted as it always had by necessity. When a cook fell ill, the first to notice were usually the aide's young, watchful boys, older men reassigned from the front, or wounded soldiers convalescing behind the lines. They had learned the morning rituals through repetition, the gathering of wood, the checking of pots, the sorting of ingredients. And when their cook did not rise, they knew the day would not wait. The aides took up the routine. Awkward at first, one might attempt to light the fire, shielding the spark from the wind with trembling fingers. Another might ladle out portions too generously, not yet knowing how to stretch ingredients across 40 men. Cooks, even across units, shared quiet bonds. They swapped salt for oil, onions for barley, news for techniques. When one fell ill, another might send over a small pot of stew, or walk the younger assistants through the steps of the day's rations. No orders required this. It simply happened. Within hours, a temporary kitchen emerged, less precise, perhaps, but functional. The fire burned, the water boiled, the pot hung from the same iron hook, even if the soup inside was thinner than usual. Men lined up with bowls, a little more quietly than on other days, sensing the shift but offering no complaint. Discipline softened, but only slightly. Portions were still counted. Ashes were scattered away from the sleeping areas. The assistants, though uncertain, mimicked what they had seen. Wrapped in his coat, lying just beyond the warmth of the fire, he listened to the scrape of the ladle. Het-built. Sometimes a medic passed by, bringing boiled water, bark tea, or a cloth soaked in vinegar. More often, the care came from within the unit. A bowl of broth sat quietly at his side. A blanket offered by a younger aide. A spoon tapped against tin with a soft nod. There was no ceremony when a cook returned to his post, no formal welcome. One morning he simply stood again, hands still stiff, eyes still tired. He adjusted the seasoning, and in doing so, restored a rhythm no one had realized they missed so deeply. The men noticed, not with words, but with a quiet lightening of the air. The bowls were filled a little more evenly, the taste familiar again, the fire hotter, the pace of the day restored. In this way, the absence of a cook was not simply an inconvenience. It was a reminder of how fragile comfort could be, and how quietly it could be rebuilt. In the days that followed a cook's illness, much of army life, meals were still served, though perhaps with less finesse. Pots still steamed. Ladles still moved from hand to hand, a routine they had previously only observed. Each small choice, how long to boil the cabbage, how to ration the remaining flour, how many scoops to a bowl, required thought. These choices were never discussed at length. They were made in motion, guided by memory, instinct, and a desire not to let the others down. From one assistant to another, small gestures passed quietly. These were not orders. They were acknowledgments of shared purpose. Often older soldiers stepped in not as cooks, but as calm presences, suggestions wrapped in story. These fragments of experience were passed not as rules, but as threads to weave the fabric of continuity. A new kind of discipline emerged, the sharp discipline of drill sergeants. the ladle wiped clean. After every use, the knife passed with its handle first. The water fetched and boiled at the same hour, whether the cook was present or not. In this quiet, the kitchen held its shape. And then there was the matter of taste. It changed subtly. The flavor was less bold, more cautious. Spices, if used at all, were added sparingly. Bread was more often undercooked or burnt. Soup came thinner. But even as the taste wavered, the warmth remained. Soldiers still lined up. They still murmured their thanks, often more softly now, aware of the effort behind each bowl. Sometimes a soldier would linger at the fire after the others had eaten, holding out an empty bowl in case of second servings. There were rarely any to give, but the act itself, a glance, a silent question, became part of the rhythm. No one left truly full, but no one left unseen. When the cook's illness lingered longer than a few days, more formal arrangements were made. He brought his own habits, his own methods. The kitchen changed. Again this time, not out of improvisation, but substitution. New rhythms were introduced. Different tools, different portions, a different way of folding the cloth that covered the flour. The assistants watched closely, absorbing these variations, adjusting their movements. They waited for their own cook to return, and when he finally did, his steps slow, eyes shaded with fatigue, he was not greeted with fanfare. But the changes were immediate. No one said a word, but the line at the kitchen grew quieter, more relaxed. Even the assistants' hands, which had trembled slightly during the week of absence, moved with more certainty. They knew their place again. The cook's presence, steady, weathered, unremarkable to a casual eye, had restored a quiet balance. Later that evening, he did not speak much. He listened to the crackling of flame, to the distant murmur of camp, to the way his aides moved. And though he said nothing, he noted the slight improvements, the quieter way they worked. They had learned. He rested, and the kitchen held, and somewhere beyond the line of tents, the soldiers slept, not just from the warmth of food, but from the comfort of knowing that, even in the cook's absence, the rhythm had never truly broken. By the time the cook was fully back to his station, the field kitchen had settled into a soft balance between what had been and what had been learned. Nothing returned quite to how it was before. Some gestures were different now, some tastes adjusted, but the core rhythm, the deep steadiness, had re-emerged. The fire crackled in its usual trench. The pot hung from the familiar iron hook. The cloths were folded just so. The days resumed their silent order. He did not speak of his illness. No one asked. In the army, recovery was less about words and more about movement. A man who could stand, stir, and serve again was declared well, not by decree, but by action. Still, he moved with more care in the beginning. His hands, though steady, bore the quiet stiffness of someone who had been still too long. His assistants, now a touch more confident, offered help before being asked. One set the firewood just a bit closer to the pot. Another stirred the soup with measured circles before passing the ladle over. These silent acts were their way of saying, "We held the rhythm while you rested," he noticed. Not with praise or instruction, but with a small nod, a slight shift in how he shared tasks, a trust extended. Over time, these subtle changes shaped the kitchen anew. There was a bit more space for shared effort, a bit more give in the routine. while the structure remained bowls counted, portions measured. Fire tended with care. The presence of mutual understanding brought a kind of softness to the order. The soldiers, too, responded. They cued a touch more patiently. They brought empty bowls back without being told. One man offered a handful of herbs found in the field. Another gave up a spare slice of salted pork for the communal pot. These gestures did not appear in the official rules of war, but they were the unwritten laws of the camp, the small kindnesses that allowed men to endure not just hardship, but time. As spring approached and the snow melted into earth, the cook added more greens to the pot: nettles, dandelions, wild garlic when it could be found. The meals became brighter, not rich, not plentiful, but tinged with freshness. It was subtle, but the change marked something real: a turning of seasons, a new resilience, a small reward for having endured the long, cold months. And so the kitchen carried on. Each morning still began with the same careful rituals: the fetching of water, the lighting of fire, the measuring of grain. Each night ended with the same quiet stacking of pots, the same folding of cloths, the same careful placement of spoons. But in between those tasks, something deeper had taken root. The cook's absence had reminded the camp that the kitchen was not just one man. It was a practice, a shared act, a space where routine became refuge. When the cook lay ill beside the fire, the rhythm had faltered, but it had not broken. Others had stepped in, hands had learned, trust had grown. He returned. He brought not only food, but continuity, a way of doing things, a calm within the camp. He had not fought in the ranks. He had not charged with saber drawn, but in his quiet way he had held a line just as vital, a line of warmth, of nourishment, of ordinary care. And in doing so, he had taught the camp that resilience often lived not in the roar of battle, but in the steam of a shared pot, in the steady scrape of a spoon, in the fire that still burned even when its keeper could not. It was never carved for display. It bore no markings of pride. And yet, in the hands of a cook in Napoleon's army, the wooden spoon became something more than a simple utensil. It was a tool of quiet genius, unassuming, indispensable, and shaped as much by routine as by wood, hung from a nail on the cart's edge or tucked behind the cook's belt with a strip of cloth. The spoon accompanied its bearer through mud, snow, heat, and rain. It rarely broke, and if it did, it was often repaired with string, pitch, or even a slender nail wrapped in twine. Its purpose was too central to be discarded. It stirred breakfast, lunch, and supper. It tested broth and scraped pots. It was passed from hand to hand with care, like a trusted map, guiding each meal from raw ingredient to steaming bowl. The wooden spoon was favored for its silence. Unlike metal, it didn't clang or spark when it met the sides of a pot. In the early mornings and quiet evenings of camp life, this mattered. The soft scrape of wood on iron blended into the ambient hush, preserving the gentle tone of a kitchen at work. The cook knew the sounds his spoon made and could hear the difference between a thin stew and a thick one, simply by the way the bowl resisted the spoon's edge. There was also safety in its simplicity. A long-handled wooden spoon kept hands far from the fire. Its surface did not conduct heat, which meant fewer burns and fewer distractions. It could be rested on the rim of the pot without tipping or searing. These small advantages were never noted in official manuals, but they were remembered by every cook who reached into the pot and felt the comfort of wood against palm. Each spoon, over time, developed its own personality. Some curved slightly from use, others darkened from years of smoke and broth. Tiny notches might be cut into the handle to mark the number of campaigns, or simply to improve grip. No two spoons were quite alike, even if they had started life as identical cuttings from the same tree. New cooks sometimes received their spoon from a predecessor, especially if they had not the time or tools to fashion one of their own. In this passing, there was a quiet form of inheritance, not of wealth, but of knowledge, the balance of the spoon, the feel of its grain, the right way to scrape a pan without scarring its base. The cook who passed it on might say nothing, but in that transfer was a gesture of trust and continuity. And so, the wooden spoon became more than a utensil. It became a companion, a metronome for the day's rhythm, a symbol of steadiness. The cook's relationship with his wooden spoon was shaped through quiet repetition. Each morning, the spoon was the first tool reached for, retrieved even before firewood was stacked or the kettle filled. It was not merely a cooking implement, but a guide. Its weight in the hand gave comfort. Its familiar grain beneath the fingers offered a silent promise. The day's meals would come, just as they had yesterday, when supplies were scarce and ingredients unpredictable. The spoon became a measuring stick. Without marked cups or precise scales, a cook gauged quantity by the curve of its bowl and the arc of its pour. One level spoonful of flour, two spoonfuls of water, roughly, a stir for each handful of dried peas. A certain resistance meant the porridge would hold. A certain slosh meant more grain was needed. Cooks developed a feel for these judgments. They watched how the spoon moved, how the liquid parted, how the steam rose, how the soup clung to its edge. These observations were never written down. They passed from experience to habit, from touch to taste in the busiest camps. Where hundreds might be fed from a single pot, the spoon played a second role, that of equalizer. It delivered one scoop per bowl, measured with care and consistency. A cook could not afford to favor one man over another. The spoon enforced fairness not with authority, but with quiet repetition. It was also a tool of memory. Some spoons, smoothed from years of stirring, bore faint traces of past campaigns, a scorch mark from a fire built to high near Leipzig. Small chip where it had struck a frozen pot in the snows outside Smolensk. A knot in the wood that reminded the cook of a willow tree by the Danube where he'd carved it long ago. These marks were not flaws. They were reminders, not of glory, but of constancy. During long marches, the spoon was tucked carefully into the cook's satchel or tied with cloth to keep it clean. At night, some cooks placed it beneath their bedroll, beside their boots, or inside the fold of their coat. It was never left to chance. Losing the spoon was more than an inconvenience. It was a disruption of rhythm, of touch, of familiarity. In rare moments of rest, a cook might sand the edge smooth again with a stone, rub it lightly with animal fat, or reinforce the neck with a thread of cloth. These acts of care, though simple, carried weight. They reflected the quiet pride of a man whose task, though humble, touched every soldier in the unit. Younger aides learned from the spoon as well. Their first lessons came not from orders, but from watching how the cook dipped and poured, stirred, and tested. Eventually, they were trusted to hold the spoon themselves. The cook might hand it over without a word, stepping back to observe, not to test, but to allow experience to take root. If the stew burned, the lesson was learned. If the soup spilled, hands grew steadier. The spoon, through touch and time, taught them the rhythm of cooking under sky and smoke. And sometimes, when a cook was reassigned, injured, or gone, his spoon remained. Left behind, intentionally or not, it became a bridge between routines. The next man picked it up and felt, for a moment, the shape of someone else's work, the weight of another's habits, another's care. And with it, the kitchen continued. For all the iron and fire that defined the army's strength, it was the wooden spoon that fed its heart, not with spectacle, but with steadiness. As the camp settled into night, the spoon returned to its resting place, stone ledge by the fire. A hook carved into a wagon beam, or the fold of a canvas pouch tied shut with string. It cooled slowly, its edge still faintly warm from the last stir of the evening pot. Steam rose in the dark, no longer from meals, but from damp earth and weary boots. All was quiet. For the cook, this moment was familiar. After the bowls were washed and the pot scraped clean, after the last coal was buried beneath ash, there was a stillness in which only the wooden spoon remained in hand. Turning it over slowly, tracing the smooth curve of its back, the cook did not see a tool. He saw the day. The spoon had measured every hour, not by the clock, but by the work it performed, stirring oats in the chill before dawn, skimming fat at midday, distributing stew beneath a canopy of stars. Its touch booked no resistance. It asked nothing in return. Yet it served with quiet constancy across the army, from the high Alps to the wide plains of Prussia. Thousands of such spoons passed through the hands of men who rarely saw their names written in reports. Their battles were not of charge or retreat, but of seasoning without salt, boiling without firewood, measuring without cups. They fed the fatigue of the army, one bowl at a time, and in return, the army gave them neither rank nor recognition, but something subtler, reliance. The daily arrival of food, the heat of the fire, the rhythm of preparation. Without needing praise, the cook and his spoon became part of the landscape of survival. No ceremony marked the retirement of a spoon. When it cracked beyond repair or was lost in a stream, its absence was felt only in the hand that reached for it the next morning and grasped empty air. A new spoon would be carved rough at first, the grip unfamiliar, but over time it would learn the shape of the hand, and the hand would learn the balance of the spoon. In this way, the lineage continued not of bloodlines or metals, but of repetition, of stirring and serving, of quiet genius applied, day after day, to the ordinary miracle of making food appear where there was none before. Even now, when one walks through museums and sees the grand sabers, the polished buttons, the engraved muskets of Napoleonic memory, the wooden spoon is rarely present, too humble to display, too common to preserve. And yet, it was there in every campaign, every kitchen, every quiet dawn. Its legacy rests not in artifact, but in the rhythm it set. A rhythm of care, of consistency, of hands that served without spectacle. And so the spoon, like the cook who wielded it, passed quietly through history, simple, unadorned, essential. And when the fires faded and the soldiers slept, it remained, waiting, always, for the next morning, for the next stir, for the next quiet meal. Before the drums, there was smoke. Before sunlight stretched fully across the damp fields of the French countryside, before the first drumbeat, before commands echoed through rows of canvas, the smoke had already begun to rise. It curled gently, softly, in pale ribbons from shallow trenches where the camp kitchens stirred to life. More steam than flame, it spiraled above fires cradled by stones, thin and patient. The scent it carried wasn't always pleasant, sometimes thick with rancid fat, or the sourness of old bread, but to the cooks of Napoleon's Grande Armée, it was the smell of duty, the first breath of another long day. You might imagine the cooks rose before the rest, and you'd be right. Their mornings began in shadows, roused by the muffled clatter of ladles, the low curse of striking flint against damp kindling. The ground beneath them shifted, daily firm and grassy one morning, sludge and clay the next. Worn boots left crescent prints beside stoves built anew each dawn. Rough kitchens that varied wildly depending on the landscape and the march, dugout pits, makeshift grills atop wagons, stones ringed around brush fires. Their first task was water barrels shared with cavalry and infantry had to be hauled, ladled, poured into iron pots, still bearing the blacksmith marks of lion or Rouen. Firewood was rare and precious, often replaced with broken crates, dried dung, or brush gathered hastily before daybreak. If an axe was among the baggage, it was a luxury. More often, fuel was snapped by hand. There was no script, but there was rhythm. Every morning brought adjustments: firewood too wet, a horse missing, a company shifting location in the night. The only constant was change, and the cook moved with it. He was known not as chef but simply le cuisinièrely trained, often a former baker, butcher, or tavern boy turned soldier of sustenance. No polished aprons or gleaming whites. Here, just a grease-stained wool tunic, an ash-darkened cap like any infantryman's, and tools worn to the wood. Some cooked for 40 men, others for 100, depending on illness, attrition, or luck. Their assistants were often the wounded or the too young, pressed into service, not by skill but necessity. Together, they moved like a machine powered by hunger, chopping, portioning, improvising. Each day began with broth, thin and hot. It broke the fast from the day before: scraps of bone, salted meat, root vegetables, sliced thin to soften quickly. It was rarely flavorful, often barely enough, but its heat reached the marrow. Sometimes its aroma woke the men gently. Other times, a bugle would blare before the pot had boiled, forcing cooks to divide half-cooked stew and shout orders into the frenzy. But the cook adapted. He had to. In the Grande Armée, he was not merely a cook, he was a forager, a craftsman, a negotiator with scarcity. Over time, certain smells carried meaning. Boiled carrots meant stable supplies. Burnt onions hinted at haste, the rare smell of meat roasting. A feast day, or an officer's favor nearby. Most mornings passed in quiet concentration, not from lack of work, but because the work never stopped. Iron clanked, smoke coughed into throats, and quiet murmurs passed between men planning the day's meals with what little they had. Soldiers lined up, bowls in hand, cold and bleary, and the cook ladled out what he could. Never enough, but always something. As the morning fires faded to coals and the troops marched on. The rhythm of the kitchen shifted. Sleeves now damp with steam, boots sunk deeper into the churned mud. The cook turned to the next task, the soup. It was not elegant, no Parisian consomme, but essential. Cubes of meat, coarse vegetables, crumbled biscuit, marrowbone, boiled together for hours. If that failed, it was stretched with oats, paste, or in leanest times, boiled leather shaved thin to mimic noodles. Even that the men could name by smell. At the heart of the kitchen stood the copper cauldron, soup blackened, riveted, heavy. It stayed over fire all day, stirred with long paddles carved from broken stalks or wagon wood. The stirring was slow, meditative. Heat rose in waves, warming the cook's face, softening the world. Quartermasters came and went, bearing tallies, scratched onto wood, how many men, how much flour, when the next cart might arrive. These visits offered data, not comfort. One delay could mean 3 days without beans. A lost cart, a broken bridge, an entire kitchen left scrambling. Adaptation became instinct. Cooks learned the plants of every region: nettles, sorrel, thistle, chicory. They tied sacks to their belts and foraged just beyond camp, stashing leaves with what garlic remained. Garlic was golded, transformed even the blandest mash into something alive. There were no spices beyond salt, and if fortune smiled, peppercorns. Flavor came not from variety, but from time. Long, slow cooking softened everything tough. Meat crusted bones. Ancient cheese turned to richness in broth. Texture mattered more than taste. Still, there was dignity in this work, even under cannon fire. Even in Russian cold, so brutal that brandy froze solid and bread cracked like stone, the cook remained, wrapped in wool, splitting fat with bayonets, coaxing warmth from damp logs. He stood when others ducked. Sometimes the meat came from horses, not cruelty, but survival. A fallen horse meant meals: shoulder for stew, liver for fry, hooves for gelatin. Seared with onion and wine, horsemeat yielded a flavor both earthy and strange, foreign to us, familiar to them. When the midday meal arrived, it came swiftly. Soldiers queued with bowls, heads down. The cook, exhausted, served without flourish. Still, among the men, good cooks were known. A thicker soup, a hotter broth, word traveled. Reputation mattered. Between tasks, the cook's space became a quiet refuge. Talk of vineyards, bread ovens, children's laughter, brief murmurs softened by steam. They didn't last, but they lingered in the air like memory. Evening brought fatigue like a fog. Smoke thickened, mingled with the sounds of cleaning, muskets and brushing boots. The cook stirred one last pot, lit by the glow of flame, his silhouette hunched with use, not sorrow. The clatter softened. Bowls emptied. Soldiers cleaned them in silence and returned to tents. The cook remained. Alone now, he scraped the pot clean, added water to lift the remnants from its copper walls. Steam hissed into the hush. There was no rush. Just the practiced movements of habit. Spoon down, cloth rinsed and hung, inventory checked: flour, onions, bones, oil. A tally scratched into bark held more meaning than any map. It was the shape of tomorrow. Sometimes he tucked away small treasures: a pebble of thyme, a cube of hard cheese, a slice of dried apple. Not riches, but hope enough to bring a smile to a tired soldier. The night air grew cool. Wind brushed through the flaps of tents, carrying the familiar scent of ash, broth, and grass. These smells did not stir longing, they stirred memory, and then the cook would sit on a crate or bucket, elbows on knees, back bent by labor. He listened not for orders, but for the stillness that followed a finished day. Not emptiness, but fullness. Not silence, but rest. Sometimes men gathered near the glow of the kitchen fire, not for heat, but for presence. No words exchanged, just shared breath and smoke, the quiet comfort of endurance. Later, the cook would sleep on folded cloth beside the stove, coat wrapped around him, a cloth over his eyes. No dreams needed. The day had left enough behind, and so it began again. A new day, a new worry, salt or wood or time. Hunger in the morning, soot by noon, roots by dusk. The copper pot would rise, the fire would catch, the spoon would stir. The cook's steady, silent would begin again, feeding others before himself. No dispatch would record his name. No journal of glory would note his labor, but his fire held the line. His soup carried strength, and while history marched forward, in shouts and steel, he worked in smoke and silence. He was not seen, but he sustained. To speak of Napoleon's army is to speak of motion, of endless columns threading across Europe, of boots striking dust and mud, of cannon wheels groaning beneath ambition. But beneath this roar of conquest lay a quieter burden, the ceaseless, invisible labor of feeding an army that, at its height in Russia, swelled to over 600,000 men. Imagine the weight of that number. Hundreds of thousands of mouths, fed not once, but multiple times each day. What seems abstract in scale was, for the cooks, quartermasters, and supply officers of the Grande Armée, a daily and inescapable demand. It began not with bread or meat, but with salt. Salt was survival. It preserved meat, sustained muscles, hardened bodies for the road. Without it, rot would reach the men before the enemy ever could. Salted pork, beef, and herring were sealed in barrels, each one heavy as a man, layered in sawdust, hauled on wagons, drawn by oxen, or dragged by hand. When wheels failed, mules bore smaller crates, strapped tight, while young soldiers shouted and strained to move the rest. Flour followed rye from Poland, wheat from France, sometimes cornmeal from Italy, packed into the hard, gray biscuits known as pain diminution bread, meant not for pleasure, but for preservation. It chipped teeth if eaten dry, but softened in soup. It became a staple of life. Every division had its wagons, but order came from above. Quartermasters tallied every sack and barrel by candlelight, their ledgers filled with trembling ink. Flour issued, meat spoiled, salt lost to rain, barrels missing. The ledgers told the real story of the army's strength, line by fragile line. And always there were fires. Fires dotted every stop of the army's path, not for comfort, but for boiling, roasting, baking, burning. In forests, wood was plentiful. In plains and frozen steppe, it was dung, brush, or bark. Cooks could read the smoke black and oily meant pine, pale and acrid. Dried grass or cow dung. Feeding the Grande Armée was not merely a feat of planning, it was back-breaking labor. Each dawn began long before light. Men cleared ground, dug trenches, unloaded barrels, and set pots in rows. No ceremony, just rhythm. Relentless, exhausting rhythm. When the weather turned, when sacks soaked through, or roads became rivers, the men adapted. Moldy flour became paste. Sour meat was boiled until salt masked the decay. Even bark was dried for firewood, just to keep one more pot boiling. Food was not just fuel, it was structure. The day's rhythm moved around it. Bitter morning coffee when there was any, thin soup at noon, stew at night. Meals kept men grounded, gave form to formless days. Without them, the Grande Armée would not have died in battle, but from hunger. So, while history speaks of charges and maps, beneath every victory stood simpler things: a fire built, a spoon stirred, a biscuit broken, a barrel salted. Quiet gestures that held the army together. As the army pushed deeper into Russia, the machinery strained. Roads vanished into snow, wagons collapsed, sacks molded, salt cracked, flour spilled. The intendant militaire, the officer of provisions, fought a losing battle, not with sabers, but with supply lines. His world was numbers, not battlefields. And those numbers began to fail. Timing was everything. Bread took 10 days to bake and reach the front. Soldiers ate it in 7. If the supply rhythm faltered by axle break, wrong turn, or missing guide, the whole system staggered. In Russia, even the ground turned against them. The bread froze solid, beef became stone. Knives snapped, teeth cracked. The cooks adapted. Still, they built portable ovens, slow, shallow, and heat. Some from clay, others dug into hillsides, others made from snow and ash. The bread they baked was rough, but the scent of steam drew soldiers like prayer. It reminded them of home of lion bakeries, Strasbourg markets, warm loaves wrapped by mothers' hands. Meanwhile, the commissariat seized local stores, grain, cheese, wine, logging each find in chalk and ink. Some officers offered coin or trade, others didn't. The goods found their way into labeled carts: perishable, spoiled, edible, uncertain. Civilians joined the effort. Vivanders, women, boys, elderly, men followed the regiments, their carts rattling like ghosts. They sold tobacco, pickled vegetables, dried sausage, and, when rations failed, hope itself. Soldiers bartered buttons and bullets for handfuls of lentils. But even the best plans broke beneath the Russian cold. Depots were abandoned, carts burned, salted fish froze into blocks. Soldiers chewed barley raw, gnawed leather, or traded for candle wax to melt into paste. Hunger became endless. Fires died. Cooks watched their empty pots in silence. Still, the instinct to feed endured. Soldiers saved crusts, carried embers, shared heat. One journal tells of a cavalryman who found a half-frozen sack of oats beneath snow. He boiled it with melted ice over a fire made from tent poles. He didn't describe its taste, only what it meant. It was warmth. It was yesterday. It was the sound of spoons, not gunfire. In such moments, food was no longer sustenance. It was memory, mercy, proof that someone still cared. The Grande Armée, reduced and retreating, still clung to the cook's rhythm. Meals became smaller, simpler. Fires grew weak. But the cook remained moving, not from orders, but instinct. Salt ran out. Ashes mimicked its temps. Bones were reused, simmered again and again. Biscuits crumbled into paste. But still the cook stirred, still he served. Even in the final days, he bent to gather wild sage, dry bay, frozen mint from the cracks in village ruins. Crushed between palms and added to broth, the scent was faint but unmistakable. There was no applause, no glory. But in the ladle lifted, in the portion handed over, in the shared silence of the pot, there was grace. The ledgers faded into scratches. Numbers gave way to need. Could one biscuit feed 7? Could one more fire last an hour? The cook answered, not with words, but with work. When the army returned, the supply lines thickened. Mills resumed, fires grew. Yet the cooks stayed quiet. Their seasoning remained humble, their motions unchanged. They had learned that simplicity is strength. Decades later, old soldiers told their stories, not of formations or medals, but of stew on the coldest day, of a biscuit softened with soup, of a cook named who managed to serve something warm when all hope seemed lost. These were the memories that endured. Because the food was not fine, it was there, and so, beneath the battles, the glory, the ruin, there was the cook. The barrel turned, the smoke rose, the spoon stirred, and the army marched on. Amid the muskets and sabers, the drums and the endless marches, Napoleon's Grande Armée carried tools of another kind, quieter, humbler, but no less vital. Among them, the copper pot, not a symbol of grandeur, but of endurance. Not a weapon, but a vessel that fed an empire. Picture it, round and wide-mouthed, darkened with soot, its handles riveted in place, its base scorched from years of open fires. It wasn't elegant, but it was trusted. These pots, battered and blackened, kept soldiers alive when little else could. Hammered from copperknot for beauty, but for its ability to distribute heat evenly, they adapted to the wild, shifting fires of the field. Kindling might burn unevenly, wind might tease the flames, but the pot knew how to hold heat and deliver warmth. It rarely cracked, even after years of war and travel. Issued in stacks by the quartermaster corps, they came in many sizes. Small ones fed a few. The largest required 2 men to carry them like stretchers. Some were official, but many were not. Soldiers brought their own handed down from family kitchens, traded for boots, or bartered from villagers along the way. A pot might have once boiled lentils in a Marseille hearth, or simmered beans in the Limousin countryside. Each pot told a story. Some bore initials scratched in by bored privates. Others had measuring notches etched along the rim. Some were patched with iron or sealed with wax, their scars buried under layers of soot. One pot, according to an old memoir, made the journey from Austria to Moscow and back again. Its owner called it Marie, not after a sweetheart, but after his mother's stew. Maintaining them was a daily act of care. Copper tarnishes if left damp and reacts with acid if unlined. Cooks scrubbed with sand or ash, dried them with rags torn from old tunics. The soot, left undisturbed, became a kind of armor-rich layer, a record of places, seasons, and struggles survived. Other tools joined the pot's orbit, long-handled iron ladles, cloth-wrapped to guard against burns, wooden spoons carved by hand when others broke, wire strainers, nail-made skewers, tongs shaped from scrap. None were beautiful, but all were precise, known by feel, sound, and weight. Then there were the knives, short, curved, worn smooth by grease and grip. They cut roots and meat, canvas and bandages. They were never far from a cook's hand. Cooks bundled their tools in satchels or tied cloths, carried them on shoulders, or packed them with barrels of vinegar and sacks of grain. At night, they placed them near the fire, not too close to warp, but always within reach. Sometimes they modified their pots, a spout hammered in, a lid reshaped to fit tight. These tricks weren't taught, they were passed hand to hand, whispered over steam and silence, and always the copper pot endured it. Outlasted commanders and uniforms, survived storms and retreats. It gave no complaint, asked for no rest. It simply waited for the next fire, the next scraps of meat or roots, the next moment to serve at dawn. Cloaked cooks took it up like a tool long known. They built kitchens around its stones for fire, channels, tripods for balance, crates for tables. A bunch of wild garlic or herbs might be dropped beside it without a word. When the lid lifted, steam curled into the morning, carrying with it the promise of warmth. The pot dictated time. A slow boil meant a steady stew. A violent simmer meant wood was burning too fast. A silence meant the fire had gone out. Cooks listened to the hiss, the murmur, the whisper of bubbling, no thermometer needed. A burnt stew was a lesson. A crust of ash on the bottom told its own story. The pot taught through rhythm, not theory. Some pots were shallow and wide, others narrow and deep. A few had lids that doubled as pans. Most lids didn't fit, held down with stones or tied in place. In rain, they kept out ash. In snow, they were buried for insulation. Carrying them took coordination. One man might sling it with a rope. Two might use a rod between handles. The motion required rhythm, or the stew would slosh and spill. In summer, food spoiled fast. In winter, it froze. But through forests, marshes, and mountains, the pot came along quiet and constant. For soldiers, it was a rare certainty. They returned from patrol or skirmish and found it there, over fire, half full, waiting. Its presence meant care, even. The tools that surrounded it, the ladle, the knife, the paddle, moved with a rhythm that mirrored the march, slow, patient, unwavering. When a pot cracked, it was treated almost like a casualty. Cooks gathered, tested leaks, debated fixes, wax, cloth, hammered, patches, whatever it took. Losing a pot meant hunger, and hunger meant danger. Officers sometimes pulled smiths from other duties just to save a cook's pot. The relationship between cook and pot was quiet, but deep. On cold nights, soldiers leaned near not for food, but for heat. On the road, they talked about it, what it might be cooking, what they remembered from the night before. It never changed, it never failed. It became a companion. In time, these pots aged alongside the men. The copper lost its shine, darkened to bronze and umber. Dents and soot marked their journeys. Some traveled farther than their carriers, passed between units, repaired again and again. When the war moved on, they remained in carts, in farm kitchens, in monastery hearths. A few were melted down into bells or roofing, but their legacy lingered. Years later, old soldiers, sitting in cafes or beside home fires, would remember not only battles, but the sound of ladle on pot, the rising steam, the smell of stew in cold air. They remembered warmth. They remembered being fed. They remembered survival. In the grand sweep of history, the copper pot earned no medals. It has no monuments, but it fed an army. It held the heat when nothing else did. and in doing so, it carved its place not in glory, but in memory, in steam, in silence. Long before military rations were measured in calories and sealed in tin, soldiers survived on what they could carry or what they could find. In the world of Napoleon's Grande Armée, where men marched for weeks across scorched plains and frozen rivers, meals weren't planned. They were invented, not from cookbooks or supply charts, but from fatigue, scarcity, and the stubborn will to endure. Among these battlefield improvisations, two ingredients emerged as unlikely pillars of sustenance: horsemeat and hard bread. Neither was chosen. Both were endured. The army, vast and scattered, was less a single machine and more a moving mosaic of campfires, wagons, and weary routines. Roads collapsed, barrels spoiled, salt ran low, and supplies vanished into mud and snow. In such moments, cooks turned not to abundance, but to what remained. When rations failed, men adapted not with defiance, but with quiet resolve. And so, in pot after battered pot, horsemeat and pain diminution, the unyielding military biscuit became the foundation of survival. Horses, once symbols of speed and strength, became sacrifices, not from cruelty, but from need. When animals collapsed from frost, hunger, or exhaustion, they were not abandoned, they were transformed. Cooks worked swiftly and without sentiment, stripping flank and shoulder beneath the flicker of lanterns. The meat was coarse and sinewed, dark and dense, but with patience, fire, and salt, if there was any left, it softened. Water, if it could be spared, soaked the meat. Ash or wild herbs rubbed into the flesh helped preserve it. Slices were dried on hot stones or lowered into simmering stews. Its flavor was foreign, deep, iron-rich, almost sweet, but to the men who ate it, it came to taste like resilience, and always, beside it, the hard bread, twice baked into slabs tougher than stone. These biscuits were as indestructible as they were inedible without preparation. They were carried in linen pouches, cracked against musket stocks, softened in broth, melted in snow. Some men tucked them under their coats as they marched, letting body heat ease their edges. Others crushed them with bayonets, hammers, even boot heels. Eaten dry, they dissolved slowly, stretching time through hunger. When meat ran out, the bread alone was the meal, steeped in garlic water, crumbled with dried onion, or soaked in a splash of sour wine. It became porridge, a thin comfort, but comfort nonetheless. Yet, out of this hardship, a strange ritual emerged. Cooks shared wisdom like code. Boil it twice if it's old. Fry in fat if you find fat. Garlic burns at it last. Recipes weren't written down. They traveled by memory, across frozen rivers and fields of smoke. One veteran, writing decades later, remembered a soup of horse marrow, bread, and wild nettle. He called it soup de courage, not for its flavor, but for how it kept his hands from shaking. Around the pot, the day found rhythm. A bowl before the march, a biscuit at midday, a hot, thin stew by dusk. The scraping of spoons was a metronome. It measured not just hunger, but time measured, ground covered, strength held, lives still intact. The tools were few: a copper pot, a wooden spoon, a blade. Cooks judged doneness by smell and sound. If the spoon slid clean through the stew, it was ready. If it dragged, the fire was lowered. A dull aroma meant more herbs or ash, no spice, no garnish, only what the land allowed, and what could be spared. In the woods, they found nettles and dock. In the mountains, chestnuts and dried grain. In spring, wild garlic perfumed the air. When villages were near abandoned, or kind turnips, leeks, or lard transformed a meager pot into something that could almost be called a meal. Meals were shared without ceremony, a nod if it was good, a grunt if it wasn't. Complaints were rare. The act of eating together, silently, was enough in time. What had once been symbols of lack became symbols of survival. When the drums fell silent and the Grande Armée staggered homeward through Russia's snows, Spain's heat, and history's shadow, their hunger followed. But so did their memory of meals made without measure, of firelight on frozen cheeks, of a ladle passed hand to hand. Veterans spoke less of battle than of broth, not with pride, but with reverence. Some cooked those meals again to relive pain, but to recall steadiness. They stewed lean beef when horse was no longer needed. They soaked bread in warm milk for children, teaching them to savor slowness. In quiet kitchens, they stirred like they once did in trenches, measuring not just ingredients, but days survived. And though the recipes faded, a few echoes remained. A soup of boiled bread and garlic, a dish of vinegar-splashed meat, a tradition of soaking stale crusts in broth, humble foods, uncelebrated, but sacred in their endurance. Military history tallies food by the pound, but soldiers remember it by feel the warmth of a bowl, the weight of a spoon, the silence of a meal after the march. These things never made it into the ledgers, but they fed the army just the same, the cook stirring by lamplight, the bread softening in broth, the steam curling in the air like breath, horsemeat and hard bread, a cuisine of necessity, a memory still warm. In the long retreat from Moscow, when the world was white with silence and wind, bread became more than sustenance. It became memory, warmth, and hope. In a frozen landscape where firewood splintered too fast and the ground refused to yield, the act of baking was nothing short of a quiet miracle. Here, among hunger and frostbite, soldiers of Napoleon's Grande Army learned to build ovens from snow, ash, and human will. The grand bakeries of France, with their stone hearths and wide ovens, were far behind. In their place rose strange mounds of compacted snow, blackened with soot, smoking softly in the cold. From these makeshift ovens came loaves, not golden and crusted, but dense, dark, and laced with the flavor of bark and smoke. Still, they were bread, and that was enough. These ovens were never planned. They were born of absence. When wagons were lost and supply lines collapsed, when flour froze in its sacks and nothing dry could be gathered for fire, the cooks improvised. A shallow hollow was pressed into the snow, lined with stone if any could be found, or shaped by hand and boot. Coals, carried in helmets or wrapped in cloth, were poured into the pit. The snow hissed, hardened, and slowly formed an icy dome. There was no door, no timer, only instinct. Once the snow had crusted into shape, the coals were swept aside. A rough disk of dough, flattened by cold, stiff fingers, was slid inside, resting on bark, tin, or the back of a shovel. The cook crouched low, listening. When the bread began to crackle, when it firmed under a finger, it was gently pulled from the heat, often scorching the knuckles in the process. The result was heavy. The top damp, the bottom burned, but it was real. It could be torn, chewed, passed hand to hand. And in that moment, in a land of cold and silence, that was everything. Flour was scarce, doled out in handfuls. Sometimes it was stretched with powdered bark or ashes. Sometimes snow was added to soften the mix. A pinch of salt, if available, transformed everything. A spoonful of sour leaven kept warm in a soldier's coat lifted the dough just enough. Most of the time, it remained flat and unleavened, slapped between stones and flipped with a bayonet. In more desperate cases, it was baked directly on the coals and scraped free with a knife. Each round of bread was a quiet triumph. The faintest sent a trace of warmth. Smoke, grain drew men toward the fire. For a moment, faces softened. The smell reached across memory, summoning images of bakeries in Alsace, hearths in Burgundy, kitchens in forgotten towns. The texture was coarse, the crust thick, the crumb often wet or raw. But in a world where hunger hollowed the body and wind peeled away warmth, bread became sacred. It was broken slowly, eaten silently, shared without question. In baking, even primitively, the soldiers found rhythm, mix, shape, weight, bake, break, a ritual, one of the few left intact. Around snow ovens, men crouched with backs to the wind and hands to the heat, not just for survival, but for something familiar, something human. Baking in such conditions demanded more than ingredients. It required patience, ingenuity, a willingness to try again, even when the snow collapsed or the dough froze before it met the fire. The ovens lasted only a day, two, at most. They were pressed into snowbanks, their domes smoothed and hollowed by hand. Some were lined with scrap iron or broken cart panels. Most were left bare. The fire did its work regardless. The dome radiated heat inward, and once the coals were pulled away, the oven retained just enough warmth to bake something small. The dough was mixed in silence. Red, chapped hands moved slowly, working flour with melted snow or water pooled beneath blankets. The mix was always imperfect, too wet, too dry, too rough. Still, it was shaped into thin cakes, no thicker than a finger, for faster baking and easier sharing. These were slid into the oven's mouth with a stick or the flat of a bayonet. The heat, reflected inward by the icy crust, began to bake. Smell earthy, faintly smoky rose, slowly curling out into the cold and drawing men near. They came without words, not from discipline, but from exhaustion. The silence of snow had become their common language. They watched the cook work, turning the cakes, adjusting coals. No one asked for more. They simply waited. When the bread was done, it was scored into quarters and passed out, hot and dense. Some dipped it in thin soup, others warmed it in their palms before eating. A few tucked half into their coat for morning. In one unit, the first piece always went to the sick, wrapped in cloth and delivered by hand. There were no orders for this. It was just done. These gestures, quiet, shared, unspoken, bound the men more tightly than any flag around the oven. The world didn't feel like war. It felt, if briefly, like a village. Laughter even returned. Someone would joke that the bread could stop a bullet, or offer his musket for butter. These moments were soft and fleeting, but they mattered. The ovens left no trace. Once the coals were gone, the domes collapsed, snow melted, ash was swept away, but the memory remained. Soldiers would recall the crack of crust, the rising steam, the golden flicker of fire against snow. They remembered not glory or command, but the feel of bread in cold hands. Years later, in quiet homes, veterans would glance at rising loaves and say softly, "We made bread in snow once." They wouldn't elaborate. The memory didn't arrive in stories, but in fragments. The scent of smoke, the sound of crust breaking, the warmth of dough in frozen palms. Some of the methods endured. Families passed down strange habits, soaking bark in boiling water, warming dough undercoats, baking on flat stones. No one quite remembered where they came from, but they remained, because the act itself mattered. It wasn't just about bread. It was about presence, about care. Even when the dough failed, when the fire sputtered, when the cold stole every scrap of comfort, the soldiers tried again. The oven was rebuilt, the dough mixed once more, not by command, but by need, and in that simple, persistent, ritual shaping, baking, breaking, they preserved something more than life. They preserved dignity. Today, those ovens are long gone. But in the hush of snowfall, beside a quiet fire, if you press dough into your palms and feel the warmth rise, you may feel it. A memory without name, a rhythm older than war, a whisper of what it means to keep going. Flour, fire, time, and the warmth, that's enough to share. In the long shadow of retreat, when the earth had hardened beneath frost, and the air snapped like brittle glass, hunger ceased to be a feeling. It became a condition. During Napoleon's doomed march from Moscow, the very idea of a meal changed. There was no longer talk of taste, no thought of recipes, only survival. And so, something once unthinkable became ordinary: the boiling of leather. This was not barbarity. It was ingenuity, born of desperation. When rations disappeared, and the last crust of biscuit, the final sliver of salted meat, was gone, men turned to what remained, not trees or stones, but their own gear: belts, satchel straps, saddle flaps, bits of their boots. These were made from untreated cowhide or horsehide natural leathers, tanned with organic compounds, softened with oils. If scraped and boiled long enough, they released collagen. The result was not pleasant, but it was warm. It could be chewed. It could be endured. A soldier might start by slicing a strip from the inside of his boot, where snow hadn't yet stiffened the grain. He'd clean it of dirt, grease, and metal. If time allowed, it soaked in water. Otherwise, it went straight to the pot. Boiling took hours. The scent was heavy, musty, sweet like scorched wool and damp parchment. It lingered in clothes, tense, memory, and still the men leaned in and ate. Each bite was an act of quiet defiance. The broth was pale, thick, almost paste-like. The leather, when boiled long enough, softened to the texture of old doppelable, slow to chew, impossible to swallow quickly. Some added snow to stretch the pot. Others stirred in ashes for salt, or tossed in wild herbs when they could be found beneath the frost. This was not madness. This was method. Cooks adapted. Those still with the columns learned which leathers softened best, holder straps worn smooth by years of touch. They learned to strip away dyed or waxed surfaces, to boil twice, even 3 times, skimming the scum with improvised ladles. When leather ran out, they boiled cloth, cotton, wool, anything. In those bitter moments, the pot was no longer just for food. It was a symbol of rhythm, of order. of something that still functioned when nothing else did. Around the fire, men sat close. The cook stirred. A spoon tested the broth. A silent nod followed. No one smiled, but no one left either. And when bowls were passed strip by strip, broth by broth, there was a silence deeper than prayer. That smell, once strange, became familiar, a companion on the road. It clung to uniforms and tent seams. It told them, "You are still alive. You can still go on." As the Russian winter deepened and the army thinned, even boiling water became a triumph. Wood was rare. Fires burned low. Men huddled around embers. Still, they boiled. Always, it began with selection. Not all leather yielded. Saddle skirts were best broad, untreated. Belts followed. Boots, though abundant, were last resorts. Their hardened soles and lacquered polish resisted even the most patient flame. Scraps were scraped, cleaned sometimes with bayonets, sometimes with glass shards from shattered wagons. Rivets were pried loose. The leather was scored, rinsed with melted snow, and lowered into the pot. Then the fire was coaxed into life. Broken carts, frozen roots, half-burnt logs from abandoned homes, anything to keep the heat steady. Soldiers gathered around, not just to eat, but to warm their hands, dry their gloves, feel the semblance of a world not yet fully lost. The smell rose again, leathery, smoky, faintly bitter. For those starving, it was oddly reassuring, not appetizing, but familiar, predictable. Even in this, cooks experimented. Pine needles were steeped for their sharpness. Charcoal was crushed into the broth. Some mixed shaved leather with powdered biscuit to form patties fried on flat stones. Most of these efforts failed, but their existence mattered. They were declarations. We have not yet surrendered. Leather never became tender. At best, it tore. Like thick rubber. It had no taste beyond the broth, earthy, faintly alkaline. But it lingered. It filled the mouth. It gave weight to the cold. Meals were quiet, focused. Men chewed slowly, inwardly. The act of eating became resistance. Shoulder to shoulder, they passed bowls and spoons. Sometimes strips were shared like gum, one piece between three. When pots emptied, residue was scraped with cloth or biscuit. Fingers wiped the bottom. Nothing wasted. These scenes repeated across miles. One frozen bridge to the next, one crumbling village to another. Other substitutes joined the pot paper, soaked into gruel, bark peeled and boiled, even washed bandages, stewed for body. None nourished, but all filled time. All gave shape to another hour survived. There was dignity in this, not in the food, but in the manner. The cook stirred boiled leather with the same care he once gave to lentil soup. His rhythm never changed. He portioned with precision. He worked in silence. In his hands, even scraps became something close to a meal. Some soldiers recorded what they could, scrawled notes in charcoal or soot on the backs of letters. Boil boot, 6 hours. Skim every 20. Soak cloth overnight. Too tough if rushed. Add bark only when water's clean. These were not recipes. They were instructions for staying alive. Others etched words into the leather itself. Mier, Q, reen better than nothing. Encore debout, still standing. These were not jokes. They were affirmations. The scent of boiled leather became part of the march. It clung to snow and silence. It outlasted muskets. It moved with them. By the time spring crept back across the ruined hills of Europe, the hunger eased. but the scent remained in boots, in memory. Home. Men rarely spoke of it. At their own kitchen tables, surrounded again by bread and butter, wine and salt, they said little. But sometimes a glance at an old satchel strap or the feel of stiff leather beneath their fingers stirred the memory. Not with pride, not with grief, but gently. To those who had not known hunger, the story seemed myth. But for those who had walked through that frost, it was vivid. The ribbon of steam rising into the cold, the way a spoonful warmed the mouth, the hush that always fell before the first bite. When these memories were shared, it was only among those who had lived them, former comrades, side by side. No boasts, no embellishments, just the facts. Which bark boiled best, which strap softened fastest, how to warm a strip beneath the arm before cooking. One man recalled chewing a frozen boot sole beneath falling snow, his fire gone out. The longest meal of my life, he said. These stories weren't told for sympathy. They were how memory marked time, like rings in a tree, quiet, steady. The tools are mostly gone now. The pots, the scorched spoons, lost 2 years, but the motion remains. Somewhere, an old man stirs soup with the same rhythm, taps the spoon once, serves without words. Boiled leather never became food, but it became a symbol of what could be endured, of what could be made from nothing, of the line between survival and surrender, and how, by the fire, men chose to cross it. In quiet kitchens across France, some habits survive. Broth boiled long after the bones are gone. Bread softened in garlic water. Meals that ask nothing of glory but speak of endurance. These are echoes, not of triumph, but of resilience. And somewhere, deep in the folds of history, the memory of boiled leather still simmers, gently, patiently, like the fire that once warmed cold hands and kept a soldier moving forward, one silent spoonful at a time. Thank you for resting here a while, for stepping into the quiet world of soot-darkened pots, morning fires, and the quiet care of a cook who stirred more than just soup. If your eyes feel heavier now, it's only the calm weight of time wrapping gently around you. May your night be as steady and comforting as the rhythm of a spoon on iron, soft and unhurried. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, you're warmly welcome to subscribe only. If it feels right, and if you're still awake, feel free to whisper where you're listening from, or just say goodnight below for now. Sleep well, and let the past keep you company a little longer.